Hi all, I have a very interesting game strategically from my perspective to show you from the US Chess Championship in round 2. Fabiano Caruana, Super Grandmaster, was playing against Samuel Shankland. I don't know if you remember, I had a fun game against Shankland years back on the ICC. I'll give you a link to that if you want to check that out, by the way, just for fun. So anyway, in this game, Fabiano kicked off with e4, and actually Samuel Shankland kicked off with the French defense with black. So the French defense can be sometimes a little bit passive. The classic symptoms of a French defense going wrong includes having a bad bishop on c8, or later, you know, blocked in by its own pawns, having weak dark squares. But on the other hand, quite often the French defense endgame is quite good. Sometimes the pawns are weak. So it's a double-edged opening choice. But yeah, let's see. We have the winner variation. So with knight c3, white is not minding this pin. So bishop b4, we go into the winner actually. There are other alternatives here, like knight f6, the classical variation, trying to encourage white to close the center. But bishop b4, I mean, there's also d takes e4, but anyway. So here we have a winner, and e5 is played. Quite often c5 is played immediately. Here it's not. This is another popular idea, knight e7. And now we have a3, really prompting that bishop to take on c3, which kind of strengthens the white center. And a classic Fischer plan in many Fischer games was actually to play a4 and bishop a3 later, because you can see that this is white's trump card out of the opening. One of white's trump cards is also this dark square bishop and potentially weakened dark squares. So getting on this diagonal, sometimes that's quite sensitive. We see c5. Now here queen g4, and historically there have been some quite popular ideas in this position, like king f8 even, just to protect g7. Queen c7 is going into a gambit with quite theoretically analysed, but this is another very popular move, just castling actually to defend g7. You might think it seems a little bit unsafe because white has this bishop pair and seemingly more space on the king side, but it's okay actually, theoretically at least. Bishop d3, we have knight bc6. And here now, white prompts black to do something about this mate in one, either to create some weaknesses or some sort of compromise. We have knight g6, so not touching the pawns. That would be pretty dangerous actually. If we touch the pawns here like g6, then queen h6, and then later a knight's going to appear on g5, and that's going to be the end of the game. So yeah, knight g6. Now here, usually in this position, theoretically, knight f3 is played. This is a little bit rarer to play knight h3. Knight f3 does have the advantage of keeping an eye on the central pawns, which could be advantageous to white if white ever wants to be able to play d takes c5 without e5 collapsing. So this may be, in some ways, it's less trodden, maybe a little bit of a surprise, quirky move to face instead of knight f3. We see queen c7 here. Another try in this position is actually, interestingly, queen e8, because maybe with f5 later, this could be good as another try. But so the queen coming to c7 clearly has some ideas on the c file here. And black is also, of course, threatening c takes d4 now, and knight takes d4. So white defends his d4 pawn with the bishop. If the knight had been there, that in some ways wouldn't have been such an issue, I guess. But c4, now this is quite committal strategically. Very interesting, though, that black is kind of condemning these dark squares. If ever this bishop got onto this diagonal, the Fischer diagonal against the French defense in the winner, then it's going to be a nuisance. And in fact, white's light square bishop here isn't that great in this pawn chain, and it's actually just exchanged off for the knight on g6. Black captures away from the center. Well, if hg, that's just asking for trouble. Queen h4, then knight g5 later is looking pretty scary. It just looks like too much to survive that. But fg, at least it opens that f file. It gives f7 for the queen as well. And in fact, the f7 square now is immediately used. After this queen g4, we see queen f7. Knight f4. It's actually a lot of pressure on black's position though. And in fact, white feels as though white's got a free hand here on the king side, with moves like h4 being possible. White is not obliged to castle. That rook can be conveniently used here to try and cause some damage potentially on the king side. So we see this retreating knight trying to help defend. h4. Now here h6 is played, and you can see that knight e7 is at least stopping a knight being installed on g6 here that easily. We see queen coming back here to e2, so it's actually preparing though this move g4. It's just gone out of the way for g4. So white's actually just gaining space. It seems as though, yeah, white's playing with a free hand, and that's actually another symptom of French defense players have had to put up with that, sometimes in passive looking positions. Sometimes white's just getting a free hand on one side of the board, and you have to put up with that and grovel for a bit and hope for sometimes a good end game. Now here actually black plays quite an energetic plan based on the pressure on f4 and the f file. And also, it would seem if white's pawn structure could be undermined, it would be like here to try and undermine d4 later. We see quite an aggressive idea, b5, just to try and potentially undermine the white pawn chain, and also sometimes potentially cause some issues around f4 indirectly if white has to defend the pawn chain. So we see f3 actually being played. And this looks a little bit cheeky, as if what is white doing with his king? Is he going to bring his king to g3 just to protect the knight or something? It seems a little bit cheeky that white's just celebrating his space advantage and kind of bind on the position. Now black again is playing energetically a5, as though he's interested in breaking this pawn chain, and the king does actually just come to f2. White has to watch out for things like g5 at all times, as long as f3 is not a major liability behind that knight, but it still has to be looked out for. And you'll note that the queen, should stay around trying to sometimes defend also the central squares, as well as f3 and some of these variations coming up behind the scenes. Rook ab8, we see king g3, and it seems, yes, looking like a bit of a cheeky king walk, saying to black, well, what are you doing here? And actually, this is quite a recurrent theme in this game. What is black actually doing? It seems as though black's kind of, at the moment, playing kind of energetically for b4. The thing is, could this backfire? Because the white rooks are now connected. Can they just use this b4 to infiltrate into the black position later? And also, this bishop, as I say, this Fischer diagonal against the winnow, this a3 to f8 diagonal, if a dark square bishop ever goes onto this diagonal later, then that could be a nuisance. Bishop e8, yes, it doesn't seem like the most inspired position for black. Bishop d2, saying to black, do you really want to play b4? It's holding up f4 and it seems b4 in a way, but b4 is played anyway, kind of rebelliously b4. So here we see a takes b4, which opens up the a file for white. And black is potentially, it looks as though black's looking at b takes c3 to dislodge the knight. Bishop takes, then queen takes. But white just calmly plays rook hb1. And a move like b takes c3, there's actually rook takes b8 here for that pin anyway. So if takes, then queen e3 to hold the knight and collect the pawn later is safe enough, it seems, because it also holds f3 against the g5 possibility. So b takes c3 is not a destructive positional sacrifice. I'll just show you that. This is something I've just checked out earlier. This position here, there's pressure on f4. There's also f3 underneath it. So if queen takes d2, there'll be g5. But if queen e3 here, this is okay for white. Is the exchange up. So that's this active play from black is not really reaping a reward at the moment. We see knight c6. Yes, there's more pressure on the pawn chain, it seems, but queen e3, it just keeps a tight grip on not just d4 but f3 as well simultaneously. So black's being held here. This f-file dynamic isn't such a spectacular f-file dynamic. There have been more aggressive f-file pressures. So b3, this is another committal decision, because now look at this diagonal, and in fact we see the Fischer bishop coming against the winner. Yeah, the bishop's coming to this diagonal, even at the cost of a temporary pawn sack potentially here. That knight's protecting the rook, but no, black's not interested in b takes c2 here. We see bishop d7 connecting the rooks, and again this pawn is just left for the taking. Yeah, the bishop's come onto the ideal diagonal, and that will reduce black's f-file pressure now on the knight. B takes c2, that is taken, temporary pawn sack, but white's really building up really classic trump cards against the French defense here. This beautiful bishop, the weakened dark squares. This bishop's not really doing much. White's even managed to get rid of his light square bishop, which wouldn't have been that relevant in the position. So we start to see a positional strangulation here. Rook takes c2, rook c8, white is hijacking black's b4 stuff to get the a file. Yeah, this is really starting to show a backfire. Bishop d6, white now conquers the a file. So systematic strangulation here is in progress. This bishop is also just the classic downside of the French defense. Fundamentally, it's quite a bad bishop here. Queen c1, bishop f7. Yes, not too inspiring. Black is not really in a position to play g5. That can just be taken, and knight h3, that pawn be dropping off. So what is to be done with this bishop? It's just imprisoned in its own pawn chain. And in fact, white now is ramping up the pressure. This beautiful bishop is not just this diagonal, it's cutting out b8, and then white tries to take over, well, infiltrate now quite comfortably on the b file. Queen b1 eyeing g6 as well as this infiltration square b6. We see queen e8 defending g6, but now there's another infiltration square based on that weakness in the last move. It's just left b7. So behold, queen b7. Yep, trade-offs, controlling one square at the expense of the other. So that weakness of the last move. Queen b7 is a very nasty infiltration here. There's pressure now potentially on c6, but by not going to b6, there's rook a6 now from direct pressure on c6 with the rook, tying down black a bit more potentially. King h7, rook a6. Yeah, black's been really tied down here. He doesn't really want to go into this pin or whatever, knight b8. There's rook a8 there. So we see king g8. Now a direct threat, bishop c7 on the knight. The knight moves away. Bishop d6. The knight goes back. So that's a bit of a test. And now, leisurely, white moves his king away from this side of the board. And it's just keeping the torture rack going for quite some time here. Getting the king a little bit safer in theory, because sometimes white will want, white is actually preparing something to even further consolidate on the king side, to further fix down black's pawns on the king side. So we see another operation here coming up after a few king moves. We see knight h3. This is another operation to further fix down black on the king side with g5. really torturing the bishop, saying, yeah, your prison sentence is a bit longer here because I'm going to play g5, fixing down g6. So any hope of liberation with g5, yeah, you'll have to put that on hold now, especially after h5. This bishop's really condemned. After knight f4, now we see there's a faint possibility of knight e7 sometimes being useful for f5. Now not here clearly, but if this knight wants to come over to the queen side, and it does so, knight g2, knight e3, it's coming over to the queen side to help the gang over here of infiltrators on the queen side. Black is just helpless on the king side with no counterplay whatsoever. Knight c2, yeah, the knight's joining in. It's heading for the b5 square, and you can see that maybe sometimes there's a slight risk factor that knight e7 is putting pressure on b5, but even this like theoretical or this nuisance risk factor is actually taken out of the equation by Caruana here, because black's doing absolutely nothing. So if you can play waiting moves which slightly improve your position with no downside, and you can play those all out, then why not? And in fact, white just improves his king very gradually by bringing it over now. So there's no hint of any problem ever. Even here, king c1, even away from the light square bishop or the light squares. And now is the time is optimal now for this knight b5 without any knight e7 trick. You know, with, for example, bishop takes and rook b8 on b5. There's no problem for knight f5. The king's well away from this area. So this knight b5 is a terrible further infiltration, threatening knight c7 now just to win the c6 knight. Yeah, it's pure torture. This is not an advert for the French defense, this game. This is a nightmare French defense game in many respects. We see, well, I know we've had other nightmare French defences in this tournament. If you check the Wesley So against the Kobe game, because Kobe is also a French defence player. But this is a nightmare strategically, because yeah, after knight e7, black really hasn't been doing anything for the last few moves, and now the execution, putting black out of misery, knight a7, is just winning material here, because there's pressure on c8 on e7. So white's just going to be taking on e7 here if the rook moves. Yeah, a complete nightmare game. And yeah, I myself, even in my club experience a few seasons back, I just dropped the French defence. I had so many passive games of the French defence, and this game is kind of a reminder of that. I don't want to put off too many French defence players, but yeah, you know, sometimes I think you've got to really want to grind and grovel sometimes in these sorts of positions. But it didn't kind of work out here. But of course, Caruana is a super grandmaster, and he's not going to give opponents counterplay or even a glimmer of counterplay wherever possible. If he can play prophylaxis moves, he'll play them until the sun goes down, as this game shows, with the king maneuvers, locking down the king side, etc. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? I hope you got something out of it. Thanks very much.